Hi guys, my name is Natalie-May and this video is all about ISO settings in digital photography. So in digital photography, when you set your ISO setting, you're basically telling your camera how to handle your exposure. So your shutter speeds and your aperture are mechanical processes that are allowing a certain amount of light to hit the sensor, and then whatever your ISO setting is, it will then tell your camera how much brightness to add to it. In effect, it's basically processing a bit of that exposure in camera in the same way as when you put your photograph on the computer afterwards, you can edit the exposure. This is doing it a little bit inside the camera. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and their job is just to make sure that the standard across all cameras is the same. So when you're picking it up, the ISO 100 is going to act in the same way across all cameras. And that's brilliant, and that works for you. But other than that, you don't really need to worry about what it stands for. ISO settings in digital cameras is based on the idea of film. So when you load a film into an analog camera, you pick how sensitive that film is to light, and that was known as film speed or ASA. And what you did is when you wanted to, say, shoot in a really dark environment, you would pick a film that's really sensitive to light to try and help you get the best exposures. And then once you'd loaded that film in, you have the whole film, you have the film for the whole shoot, and you knew it was always sensitive to light to get you the right pictures. In digital photography, that ISO setting can now be changed, which is brilliant. And you are using the same concept. I need it to be more sensitive to light, or I need it to be less sensitive to light, dependent on your environment and your other settings. ISO is measured in whole numbers. Most cameras start at a base rate of around 100, and then as they double, the brightness increases. So what's considered a low ISO is what the camera starts at, which is usually around 100 for most digital SLRs, and then as it doubles, 200, 400, 800, it's becoming more and more sensitive to light as the film was, and therefore it's going to be brighter. So ISO works on a scale. The base rate of your camera is where you want to always be as a rule of thumb. So in an ideal scenario, will always be on, say, ISO 100. Majority of digital SLRs, that's their base rate, okay? So you're going to use your shutter speed and your aperture to get the correct exposure, and the best quality image comes on 100. That's not always possible. Sometimes your shutter speed and your aperture might not be letting enough light into the camera that you need to increase it in the processing in the camera, i.e. your ISO settings. So let's say that you're pushing that higher and higher and higher. This is brilliant, right? I can just keep doubling that brightness and making it brighter. This saves everything. However, there is a catch. Now, when you increase those ISO settings, you start to get digital noise. It looks a bit grainy, speckly. It makes you think of film grain. Now, that's not always great. Sometimes that's an aesthetic and you want that look, but in all honesty, for a really good high quality image, you don't want a lot of grain. It's always fun to add it on afterwards, not be stuck with it. Now, because of this, that's when you want to perhaps have an upper limit that you don't want to go above. You can set your camera and tell your camera, don't go above this ISO. For me personally, in a lot of my photography, I don't go above 2000 ISO, just in the way that I want my quality of my images to look. But that's pretty high considering your base rate's 100. I don't think that's a bad place to say, I don't want to go above 2000. So my rule of thumb is that, and I can set my camera to do it. But just bear in mind, the higher you go, the more grain there's going to be in your images. So try and aim a bit lower and adjust your settings. But sometimes you won't be able to, and that's how you'll work with it. And then the next step is obviously in post-production in the computer, as opposed to what it does in the camera to sort out the exposure. So ISO is really easy to set. Higher number, the brighter the image is going to be. It starts at 100 and then it doubles and doubles and doubles thereafter, just working on that scale. On your camera, if you set it on aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode, manual mode, any of those modes will actually automatically set your ISO if you ask the camera to do so. So if you really want to concentrate on those other decisions and you're not too worried about how high the ISO goes, that's fantastic, okay? Because you're always going to get that exposure. Plus, if you've set inside the camera and said, this is my limit, don't go above this, then it's a win-win scenario, right? That it's never going to go too high. If you want to manually play with it, again, as I always say, this is how you learn what it does. So set your camera up, keep the same settings, and then just change the ISO as I have here. So as it goes up in increments, as you can see, it starts to brighten the image, and the catches, if it's a darker area with a high ISO, you've got a lot of grain. But if there's a lot of light out, like we talked about with shutter speed, it can overexpose the image as well. So if it goes too bright, I tend to find the worst situation is when you go from a really dark environment straight out into sunlight, like if you're going from inside to outside and you forget to change your ISO. Oh, that one's a killer. Like we say, when you have something that's overexposed, too many highlights, too many of those high tones, it's near on impossible to get them out in post-production. So if you set your ISO to automatic, you're going to save yourself that stress and know that you're not going to go too bright or too dark. That's a fantastic place to be, and helps you work with your camera really quickly as well. A quick summary. ISO setting is there to help you with your exposures. It doesn't mechanically change anything in the camera, but it's part of the processing to help you get that correct exposure. It's going to make it a bit brighter if you increase that sensitivity and you have a higher value, but the ideal scenario is to keep that lower value and work with the other settings, because at the lower value you're going to have a higher quality imagery because you're going to have less grey, less speckles. I've been Natalie-May. This has been a video on ISO settings. I hope it's given you a little bit of an introduction and some help with getting to know what it means. Really, really important though, if you haven't checked out my video on aperture and shutter speed, please start there. ISO is definitely the third thing to learn over those two, and those three things work together, but please go check them out, and then those three things will really enable you to go out and start snapping and have a really good understanding of how photography works. So take care guys, look after each other, and I will see you soon. Bye. ISO stands for International Society of something.